Welcome. I'm LaVae Hoffman with the University of Virginia, and this is a Virginia Department of Education training webinar on narrative language microstructure analysis. Please note that this webinar is the third in a three-part series about narrative language analysis. These webinars are available from the Virginia Department of Education at the URL you see listed before you. If you have not yet viewed the first two parts of this three-part series, please do so before beginning this webinar. Recall from those first two webinars that the narrative assessment process includes several steps that start with eliciting a narrative sample or perhaps a few narrative samples to work with, then transcribing those samples, analyzing them, and interpreting them. In the first two webinars of this series, we discussed an overview of narrative language, what it is, as well as macrostructure analysis. In macrostructure analysis, we are evaluating a story for the framework or the skeleton of the story, including its story grammar and the episodic complexity. This webinar is devoted to the process of analyzing a story's microstructure, or the smaller pieces of the story. Narrative microstructure can be thought of as the way in which the storyteller ties together all of the ideas within the story to create a unified and coherent whole. Microstructure refers to looking at the smaller pieces of the story that help the story stay together. These smaller pieces are often inside the sentences. So when we're doing a microstructure analysis, we are looking at individual sentences, what that sentence is comprised of, and how each sentence relates one to another. Narrative microstructure also encompasses those parts of creativity that create an imaginative and interesting story. Some people refer to this as the sparkle in a story. I like to think of it as the quality of the story. Those are the pieces of the story that we're going to be talking about how we can evaluate them for the purposes of a comprehensive language assessment. Within microstructure, there are three basic areas that comprise the microstructure components of a story. Those three areas are cohesion, sentence structure and complexity, lexical diversity and complexity. Let's look at each of these three elements separately, beginning with cohesion. Cohesion are the pieces of language that help us to connect a story together and that help us to tie utterances, make ties across utterances, and make the ideas flow throughout the story. So essentially, cohesion is how ideas or statements relate to the text as a whole, how all of the ideas are tied together within the story. Cohesion can be created by the use of conjunctive cohesion. There are two forms of conjunctive cohesion. Conjunctive cohesion is created when we use coordinating conjunctions, such as and, but, so, or. When we tie sentences together with these forms of coordinating conjunctions, It helps to create conjunctive cohesion within the narrative. In addition, there are adverbial forms of conjunctive cohesion. When we use words such as next, later, therefore, those words help us to form bridges across sentences that also tie ideas together. Coordinating forms and adverbial forms create conjunctive cohesion within a story. In addition, storytellers use referential cohesion. Referential cohesion is when we use words that refer back to earlier ideas or elements in the story. Two basic forms of referential cohesion are the use of personal pronouns. When a protagonist is initially introduced into a story, they are often given a name, but later we refer back to those characters with pronouns like he, she, they, us, we. Similarly, we can use demonstrative pronouns like that, this, these, those, to stand in place of more specific nouns that had already been introduced into the story earlier. Personal pronouns and demonstrative pronouns create referential cohesion within narratives. What we know about the developmental trajectory of cohesion is that most children can typically create narratives that are pretty cohesive by the time they're about 6 to 8 years of age. So by 6 to 8 years of age, children make narratives that include these elements of cohesive ties and are pretty easy to follow. However, cohesion continues to develop throughout the school years, and by adolescence, we expect students to be more sophisticated in their use of cohesion, as evidenced by an increase in the frequency of cohesive ties that are inside stories, as well as a greater variety of the forms of cohesive ties. In addition, as children grow and develop, their ability to create cohesive ties correctly across a greater and greater distance within stories increases. In addition, we expect students to continue to create cohesive ties that are more clear and less ambiguous as they mature. So a 7-year-old will be able to create stories that have cohesive ties, but we would expect that that student may have some elements of cohesion that are less clear for the listener. But by the time the student is 17, we would certainly expect them to be able to use more nuanced and sophisticated forms of cohesive ties, and their ties from one idea to the next should be very clear and very few instances of ambiguity in those cohesive ties. The listener should be able to follow the story without many questions about what's being referred to. When we assess cohesion within narratives, essentially we are analyzing that narrative transcript for the types of conjunctive and referential cohesion, as well as the frequency with which those types occur. In addition, we will note the differences between referential ties. For instance, take a moment to read through this brief narrative. In this short narrative, we have Mary introduced as the main character of this story. She's introduced by name, Mary, in the first sentence. In the second sentence, the storyteller refers back to Mary with the pronoun she. This use of the pronoun she is very close in location or proximity to the naming of Mary with her given name. In addition, the storyteller refers back to Mary again in the very last sentence of this narrative by again using the pronoun she. This second use of the she pronoun, however, is quite far removed from the naming of Mary in the very first sentence. So we would say that that second referential tie is distant from its referent. In addition, we have the idea of cookie. The idea of cookies is introduced in the first sentence. The speaker or the storyteller refers back to these cookies in the last sentence of the narrative with the demonstrative pronoun these and also one. The words these and one stand in place of the more specific noun cookies. Using these pronouns creates a tie in the mind of the listener back to that original, more specific noun. Therefore, in this sentence, we have these elements of referential cohesion. In addition to noting the use, frequency, and distance of conjunction and referential cohesion, we will also be analyzing narratives for instances of ambiguity when referential cohesion is attempted. Take this brief narrative, for instance. Bill was at the park, then John arrived. The score was close, so the game was really fun. Too bad he had to go home early. We have two characters introduced at the beginning of this story, Bill and John. In the last sentence of this story, we have a referential tie attempted with the pronoun he. Unfortunately, for the listener, it is unclear which character the pronoun he is referring to. We don't know whether Bill went home early or John went home early. And this is because this pronoun, he, is ambiguous in this context. Therefore, we would say that a referential cohesive tie using the pronoun he was attempted but resulted in ambiguous cohesion. In addition, in this brief little narrative, we have two instances of conjunctive cohesion with then and so. Recall that we said that there were three sources of microstructure that we would look at, the first being cohesion. We've finished cohesion. Now let's turn our attention to sentence structure and complexity. When we think about sentence pattern, which is just another term for sentence structure and complexity, when we think about sentence pattern, there are four forms of sentence patterns that we want to be familiar with: simple, elaborated, compound, and complex structures. Let's look at each of these separately, beginning with simple sentences. A simple sentence is comprised of one independent clause. Some people also call this the main clause. Main clauses, independent clauses are synonymous. An independent clause is formed with a subject and a predicate. Some authors like to describe this as a noun phrase and a verb phrase in a subject-predicate relationship. It means the same thing. Essentially, an independent clause expresses a complete idea. An independent clause will have one main verb. For instance, in our example, a man sat on the chair, we have one independent clause. That independent clause is formed by a subject, in this case, man, and a predicate, sat on the chair. A man is a noun phrase. Sat on the chair is a verb phrase. They are in a subject-predicate relationship. The complete production, a man sat on a chair, expresses one complete and full idea. There's only one main verb. This is an independent clause. Elaborated simple sentences, on the other hand, also have one independent clause. They also have one main verb. However, elaborated simple sentences have more expanded noun phrases and/or verb phrases. So in our example here, a cranky old man rocked quietly to sleep in the afternoon sunshine on a grandmother's soft antique chair. We have a very long sentence, but the sentence pattern or the sentence structure remains a single independent clause with a subject, man, and one main verb, rocked, man rocked. When we look at this sentence pattern or the sentence structure, we see that we have one noun phrase serving as the subject of the sentence, a cranky old man. In this instance, we have, in addition to the noun, which identifies the subject, man, and the article a, we also have a couple of adjectives that tell us more about the subject of the sentence. A cranky old man is an expanded noun phrase. Our verb phrase, rocked quietly to sleep in the afternoon sunshine on grandmother's soft antique chair, still has our one main verb, rocked. In addition, we have the infinitive form of sleep, to sleep, rocked to sleep. The main verb, with all additional auxiliary or helping verbs, creates the verb complex within a verb phrase. Rocked to sleep is our verb complex. Within this predicate, this verb phrase, we have, in addition to that verb complex, we have an adverb, quietly, that tells us how the rocking happened. And we have two additional prepositional phrases that give us more information. The first prepositional phrase is in the afternoon sunshine. A prepositional phrase always opens with a preposition, in this case, in, and includes a noun phrase, in this case, the afternoon sunshine. Here again, this noun phrase is a little more expanded in that we have an article, the, and the noun sunshine. In addition, we have the adjective afternoon. In the afternoon sunshine serves as an expanded noun phrase. Similarly, we have a second prepositional phrase within our verb phrase. This second prepositional phrase is on grandmother's soft antique chair, recalling that prepositional phrases open with a preposition, this time on, and include a noun phrase. In this instance, our noun phrase is expanded with grandmother's soft antique chair. So although we have a lot happening in this sentence, and it is quite long and gives us a lot of information, when we look at the sentence structure, the sentence pattern, we see that we still have a single subject and a single predicate. We have one noun phrase serving as the subject, and that noun phrase is elaborated. And we have one verb phrase. That verb phrase includes the verb complex as well as a couple of expanded prepositional phrases. So from a structural standpoint, this long sentence is still a simple sentence. However, it is qualitatively different than our first simple sentence, an old man sat on a chair. in that there are many more linguistic elements in this simple sentence. We refer to this as an elaborated simple sentence. It is elaborated because, although it still has just one independent clause, it is elaborated because it includes expanded noun phrases and/or an expanded verb phrase. So we've talked about simple sentences and elaborated simple sentences. Now let's talk about compound sentences. In compound sentences, we're still working only with independent clauses. But this time, in compound sentences, we have two or more independent clauses. And these independent clauses are joined together with a coordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunctions, the most common coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, so. And, but, so, or. Each independent clause in the compound sentence has a main verb. For example, Tom ate cookies has the main verb ate. Sally drank milk has the main verb drank. They each have separate subjects. Tom ate, Sally drank. These independent clauses could stand by themselves. We could say, Tom ate cookies, period. Sally drank milk, period. But instead, these two independent clauses are joined together with a coordinating conjunction. Tom ate cookies, but Sally drank milk. It's one production, one sentence, but it is comprised of two independent clauses linked together merely by a coordinating conjunction. Either of these independent clauses could potentially stand on its own, but instead they're linked with this coordinating conjunction. We call this a compound sentence structure. The key idea with compound sentences is that we have two or more independent clauses. Each of those clauses could stand alone, but they are not standing alone. They're linked with a coordinating conjunction. Contrast this idea with complex sentences. In complex sentence structure, we have an independent clause with a dependent clause, with one or more dependent clauses. So in complex sentences, we have not just an independent clause, but also one or more dependent clauses. Dependent clauses have clausal structure. So a dependent clause is going to have a subject and a predicate. However, a dependent clause doesn't really make sense by itself. It needs to be linked with that independent clause or the main clause, because the purpose of the dependent clause is to support the main clause in some way. The dependent clause serves to explain more about the main clause, or complete the main clause in some way, or describe the main clause further. Dependent clauses are subservient to the main clause or the independent clause. So in our example, the boy who ate cookies, we have as a dependent clause that is underlined for you. Who ate cookies is a dependent clause. The key idea with complex sentences is that the independent clause expresses the main idea of the sentence. The dependent clause is logically linked to that independent clause, but the dependent clause expresses a lesser idea to the main clause. The dependent clause is not complete without the main clause. There are three forms of dependent clauses: subordinate clauses, clausal complements, and relative clauses. Let's look at each of those types of dependent clauses. In subordination, or the forming of a subordinated clause, the dependent clause begins with a subordinating conjunction. For instance, Goldilocks made sure no one was home before she ate the porridge. Before she ate the porridge is a dependent clause. It tells us more about that main clause, Goldilocks making sure no one was home, and it opens with the subordinating conjunction before. Another example of a subordinated clause would be, if you want to catch the rabbit, you have to sneak up behind him. If you want to catch the rabbit is the dependent clause that tells us more about the main clause. It opens with the subordinating conjunction if. An interesting thing about subordinated clauses is that they can often be moved around within a sentence. So for example, we can either say, Goldilocks made sure no one was home before she ate the porridge, or we could begin the sentence with the dependent clause by saying, before she ate the porridge, Goldilocks made sure nobody was home. Here is a list of some common subordinating conjunctions in English. English has many, many subordinating conjunctions, so this is by no means an exhaustive list. However, these are many of the very common subordinating conjunctions that students use during school-age years. As you look through this list, you will note that many of these terms are adverbials that refer to a time element. When a subordinated clause begins with an adverbial that refers to time, some authors will describe this subordinated clause as an adverbial clause or a time clause. Just know that they're essentially the same thing. They are serving as dependent clauses that would create subordinated sentence structure. The second form of complex sentences would be those that are created through clausal complements. Now, clausal complements are a very interesting form of complexity in that there is an idea or suggestion that is opened up in the main clause and is completed or finished out by a separate subject and a predicate, which then form the dependent clause. So there's an idea that is asserted in the main clause, and it is finished out or completed or complemented by a clause that is the dependent clause. So for instance, he suggested they eat on the picnic table is a clausal complement. The main clause is shown in purple. He suggested. That opens up an idea, the suggestion. And what is suggested is finished out through the use of another clause with a separate subject and a predicate in the dependent clause, they eat on the picnic table. He suggested is the main clause. What is suggested forms the dependent clause, they eat on the picnic table. Both the main clause and the dependent clause, which remains underlined here in your example, both the main clause and the dependent clause have a subject and a predicate. In this instance, I've noted the subject with the blue forms. So he is the subject of the main clause. They serves as the subject of the dependent clause. And the predicates are indicated in green, or the main verbs are indicated in green for you. Suggested is the main verb of the main clause, or the independent clause. Eat is the main verb of the dependent clause. So both the main clause and the dependent clause have subjects and predicates. They both have clausal structure. However, he suggested is the main clause that opens up an idea which is finished out in the dependent clause through the use of they eat on the picnic table. The interesting thing about clausal complements that makes them very easy to pick out is that clausal complements usually follow certain types of verbs. Usually clausal complements are formed after verbs of communication. Verbs like say, said, whisper, scream, yell, talk. Or verbs of cognition or mental activity, such as think, thought, know, wonder, wish. When you see these main verbs of communication or cognition, very often they might be followed by a clausal complement. Here are some examples of clausal complements. I know the store isn't open yet. I know is the main clause. The store isn't open yet is what is known. And what is known is described using a full clause. The store isn't open yet. That forms a dependent clause. He said she was very funny. They wished the show would start. We believed this school year was fun. These are all clausal complements. All of these relatively short sentences have complex sentence structure because they have clausal complements. Please do not confuse clausal complements with simple sentences that may also use some of these verbs of communication or cognition. When we say, I know him, we are using that verb of cognition, I know, but the idea of knowing or what is known is completed or filled out with simply the addition of an object. I know him. Therefore, the sentence pattern here is simply subject, verb, object. I is the subject, know is the verb, him is the object. It is what is known. I know him. He said hello to me. They wished for rain. We believed the story. These verbs of cognition or communication are used in simple sentence structure because there is only one independent clause. In order to have complex sentence structure using a clausal complement, the idea that is opened up in the main clause through the verb of communication or cognition must be finished by another whole clause. There must be an additional subject and predicate in a subject-predicate relationship. For instance, I know the store isn't open. I know is underlined in purple as the main clause, and the dependent clause is underlined in orange. Please pause this webinar to examine these clausal structures until they are very familiar to you. Subjects are always noted in blue, main verbs in green, main clauses are underlined in purple, and dependent clauses are underlined in orange. We'll use this system of demarcation throughout the remainder of this webinar. Please pause to examine these structures until they feel very familiar to you, and then restart. Here are a few additional clausal complements for you to analyze. I knew you couldn't stay angry with him for long. The doctor said she couldn't eat pie. All of the silly children thought the teacher was playing a joke on them. Please pause your webinar and deconstruct the clausal constituents in the same way that we have been doing. Here are the clausal constituents marked for you. Please pause the webinar for as long as you would like. Complex sentences can be formed in a different manner as well, and that's through the use of relative clauses. So complex sentences can be formed when there is the addition of a dependent clause that gives us more information about the main clause, and this would be through the use of relativization or relative clauses. There are two types of relative clauses: subjective relative clauses and objective relative clauses. A subjective relative clause would be this example: the boy who told on you got in trouble at recess. Objective relative clauses, an example of that would be, I saw the boy who told on you. Let's look a little more closely at these. A subjective relative clause is the addition of a dependent clause that tells us more about the subject of the main clause. For example, the boy who told on you got in trouble at recess. In this example, we have the main clause, which is formed by the boy got in trouble at recess. This clause is the main idea of the sentence. The boy got in trouble at recess. In addition, we have some more information. Which boy got in trouble at recess? The one who told on you. So the dependent clause, who told on you, is embedded into the main clause. We have the boy who told on you got in trouble at recess. The dependent clause is inserted or embedded into the main clause in this subjective relative clause structure. Objective relative clauses, on the other hand, add a dependent clause that tells us more about the object of the main clause. So in the example, I saw the boy who told on you, we have the main clause, I saw the boy. We have the subject I, the main verb saw, and the object of what was seen, the object being the boy. I saw the boy. That's the main clause. It's an independent clause. It could stand alone. The dependent clause is another full clause with its own subject and predicate that tells us more about the object of the main clause. It tells us more about the boy. The dependent clause is who told on you. It has the subject who, the main verb told, and on you. So we have I saw the boy who told on you is a short sentence, but it has complex sentence structure because it uses an objective relative clause. The important and key component of complex sentence structure is that complex sentences will always have one or more dependent clauses in addition to the independent clause. Dependent clauses will take one of four forms. Those dependent clauses might be a subordinated clause, a clausal complement, a subjective relative clause, or an objective relative clause. That's what creates complex sentence structure. When you step through it systematically, it's really very easy to decipher or discern the sentence structure that's being used. We have simple sentences, elaborated simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences. However, human beings being wonderfully diverse and language being entirely generative, allowing us to say many infinite types of creative constructions, there are also some productions that are both compound and complex. We call these compound complex sentences. In a compound complex sentence structure, we will have at least two independent clauses that are joined by a coordinating conjunction and also one or more dependent clauses within that same sentence. An example of this would be, when it rains, Jack watches sports on TV, but Julie bakes cookies. In this example, we have two independent clauses. Jack watches sports on TV, Julie bakes cookies. Both of these independent clauses express a full idea that could stand on its own. However, they are linked with the coordinating conjunction but. Jack watches sports on TV, but Julie bakes cookies. In addition to that compound structure, we also have a dependent clause with the subordinated clause when it rains. When it rains, Jack watches sports on TV, but Julie bakes cookies. Another example of a compound complex sentence would be, the team wept with joy and the fans cheered because the final score was not even close. When we assess sentence structure for a narrative language analysis, we will want to be analyzing the narrative transcripts for the types of sentence structures that are used by the student, the frequency with which each of those types is used, and also the adequacy of those sentence patterns. In other words, were they able to use that form of sentence structure correctly or incorrectly? What did they attempt and what did they avoid even attempting? What types of sentence structures are included in the narratives of that student? So you see the types of sentences listed there before you. Simple sentences, elaborated simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. We might see when we do an analysis of sentence structure, we might see a student who is able to create simple sentences, but is not able to make elaborated simple sentences, or is unable to create many different types of complex sentences, or when they attempt to use a complex sentence, it creates a sentence that has various errors in it. All of these types of analyses, all of this data gives us insight into the student's ability to create sentences, use their syntactic skills, and also form microstructure within their narratives. Recall that microstructure of narratives includes three different forms of microstructure that we will analyze: cohesion and sentence structure complexity. We've talked about those first two forms of microstructure. Now let's turn our attention to lexical diversity and complexity. When we are analyzing narrative microstructure for lexical diversity and complexity, essentially we are looking for the word choices that the student uses, or what is their vocabulary within that story. There are some key places to look for information about the student's vocabulary and the types of words that they use and the sophistication of their vocabulary choices. Begin by looking at instances in which the student has conjoined sentences or embedded clauses, because the student's choice of coordinating conjunctions will give us insight into their command of those conjunctions and the various vocabulary words that are used. For instance, the coordinating conjunctions and, but, or so are very basic. Children begin to use these coordinating conjunctions early. However, those are not all of the coordinating conjunctions in English. There are also coordinating conjunctions in the words for, nor, and yet. However, those coordinating conjunctions are a little bit more advanced, or those specific words give us a little bit more insight into the child's use of vocabulary items. You can remember all 7 of the coordinating conjunctions with the acronym FANBOYS. So coordinating conjunctions gives us a peek into the student's use of vocabulary. In addition, we can also look at the student's use of subordinating conjunctions. There are very basic subordinating conjunctions that children start to use early, including if, before, because. A little bit later, students start to use the coordinating conjunctions like although, since, while, and unless. Even more advanced are the vocabulary items of whereas, whenever, rather than. So beginning your look at lexical use, a good place to start is those sentences that are conjoined or include dependent clauses. Another place to look for instances of more sophisticated vocabulary or word choices would be in those elaborated noun phrases. When students are creating elaborated noun phrases, there are many different ways in which they can elaborate noun phrases. I have listed in front of you the elements of noun phrases: initiators, articles, ordinals, quantifiers, adjectives, nouns, and post modifiers. Within each of those choices of pieces that can go into noun phrases, there are many different words that can be selected. In an analysis of lexical diversity and complexity, you're going to look for the sophistication of the vocabulary that is included in those elaborated noun phrases. For example, we have an example of a simple sentence in only the one exquisitely talented princess in the tiny feudal village sang. That's a simple sentence, that has simple sentence structure. However, it has a very elaborated noun phrase. And within that elaborated noun phrase, which is underlined, you will see many different vocabulary items that are pretty sophisticated, such as exquisitely, feudal, and perhaps even talented. So, when a student is using elaborated noun phrases, be sure to look at what words go into that noun phrase. Similarly, when students are using elaborated verb phrases, you will want to look for the diversity and complexity of the words that the student elects to use in that verb phrase. For instance, a princess could have been chorally singing on the steeply inclined steps of the medieval castle. That is a sentence that has simple sentence structure. However, it has a very elaborated verb phrase. And the selection of words in that verb phrase gives us an insight into the command of the vocabulary that student has. Verb phrases are very informative from a language analysis standpoint because we know that many students who have language impairments have difficulty with verb complexes. So it's really important that speech-language pathologists are familiar with the various elements of verb phrases. I've listed the elements of verb phrases before you, and you will note that every verb phrase must have a main verb, and main verbs are always marked for tense and number by the presence or absence of inflections. So a verb phrase will always have a main verb. That main verb will always be marked for tense and number. In addition, there are many optional elements in verb complexes. Modals, perfective aspects, and progressive auxiliary verbs are optional elements in the verb complex. Children who have language impairments often have difficulty mastering the verb complexes and the verb structures of English because they can be quite elaborate. So it's really important to look for the presence, absence, correct and incorrect use of these components of elaborative verb phrases. Note too that elaborative verb phrases could also include various noun phrases or prepositional phrases as part of that verb phrase. I think it's very important for us to look at these elaborated noun and verb phrases because they can reveal a student's level of ability or difficulty in various elements of language. Elaborated noun phrases and verb phrases, of course, reveal a student's semantic skills in terms of the breadth of their vocabulary. How many different words do they know? But it also gives us insight into the depth of their vocabulary. Or do they understand multiple meanings for individual words? For instance, in our last example, the student talked about the steeply inclined steps. We might also want to know whether that student understands that inclined can mean not just the degree of steepness, but inclined can also be used as an indicator of a person's, how adept a person is at any one thing. So semantic skills are certainly revealed by elaborated noun phrases. In addition, it takes a level of syntactic skills to form those elaborated noun and verb phrases. Therefore, analyzing noun and verb phrases gives us insight into some of a student's syntactic skills. And then, in addition, elaborated noun phrases and verb phrases encompass elements or understanding of social use. They include a student's command of various social registers and nuances of expression, as well as their familiarity with the whole storytelling genre. So elaborated noun and verb phrases are a really important element of microstructure to analyze. In addition, some of the places that you should look for insight into a child's selection of vocabulary items would be their use of mental verbs or cognitive verbs, such as thought, believed, hoped, wished, and assumed. You're looking for the level of sophistication of these mental verbs or cognitive verbs, as well as the linguistic verbs or verbs of communication. When a child said is probably the most basic verb of communication. But we have many more nuanced and sophisticated ways of talking about communication: whispering, confiding, announcing. You will find these verbs, instances of these mental and linguistic verbs, particularly in elements of dialogue within the story, as well as when students are communicating various macrostructure elements. For instance, verbs of mental activity or cognition can often be incorporated into the internal response element of episodic structure. In addition, analyzing for lexical diversity and complexity through mental verbs and linguistic verbs may give us insight into the level of that student's understanding of the minds of others or the theory of mind. Lexical diversity and complexity also includes analyzing for the student's use of adverbs, adverbial phrases, and adverbial clauses. And altogether, the whole range of lexical diversity and complexity, elaborated noun phrases, verb phrases, adverbs, adverbial phrases, verbs of cognition, communication, all of this together is sometimes referred to as literate language. Literate language refers to the degree of sophistication of expression that is often included in narratives. For instance, let's examine some student language. Some students might create narratives that include very basic sentences like, Goldilocks walked on the road and saw the bear's house. Compare that sentence with one produced by another student that communicates the same ideas but using more literate language. A little girl named Goldilocks was walking down the road when she saw the house where 3 bears lived. Certainly both sentences communicate essentially the same ideas, but the student who has a better command of literate language skills is certainly going to be able to have a higher degree of academic achievement and will be perceived as a better student. Compare these two examples of a basic sentence and a sentence that says essentially the same thing with literate language. So let's recap. Remember that we said that narrative assessment processes include eliciting the samples, transcribing, analyzing, and interpreting those samples. We have talked about the fact that analyzing microstructure includes looking for the various components of microstructure. Those would be cohesion, sentence complexity, and lexical diversity and complexity. When we look at those microstructure elements, for each element, we will want to analyze microstructure by tallying the types and frequencies with which those elements occur within the narrative sample. In addition, we're going to want to be able to report how many correct productions of each element were present in the story, how many errors were present in each story, and how many different types of microstructure elements may not even have been attempted at all. In addition, we will want to think about how this performance compares with what we would expect for this student's peers within this community. Essentially, does the narrative performance meet the expectations that are held as a standard for the student? Let's work through a narrative sample by analyzing it for its various parts of microstructure. The sample that we're going to be working through will always be the same, but we will look at this one sample from many different views of microstructure. Our narrative sample is, the girl in the purple dress named Anne was playing hopscotch. Then Beth, the girl sporting the green shirt, wanted to play too. Beth asked, "Can I play?" But Anne would not let her have a turn. They were not going to be friends, so Beth went home for dinner. A nice, short, sweet narrative that will allow us to look at microstructure from many different views. Please pause your webinar to examine this narrative for elements of narrative cohesion. In this narrative, we can identify instances of conjunctive cohesion in the use of the conjunctions but and so. In addition, we have examples of the use of referential cohesion with the pronouns I, her, and they. Note that the two characters in this narrative, Anne and Beth, have been introduced with specific names, and they have also been referred to, again, through the use of pronouns. Each of these pronouns have been located close to the proximity of the named character, and they are very clear in whom they are referring to. So they are unambiguous. This storyteller has been unambiguous in their use of pronominal reference. Pause your webinar and look at this narrative in terms of sentence structure. In this narrative, we see several different forms of sentence structure. We have two sentences that have elaborated simple sentence structure. Those sentences are highlighted in green on your screen. In addition, we have one complex sentence that includes a clausal complement, as noted in the green ink. We also have a couple of coordinated clauses, which are underlined. So you will note that we have one sentence that is both complex with a clausal complement and coordinated. The sentence, Beth asked, "Can I play?" but Anne would not let her have a turn, is both complex through the causal complement, Beth asked, "Can I play?" and it is also coordinated with the linking of the independent clause, Anne would not let her have a turn, with the coordinating conjunction but. So that one sentence is a coordinated complex sentence. Pause your webinar to examine our narrative for elements of lexical diversity or complexity. In this brief narrative, I think that there are probably really only three times in which more elaborated vocabulary was selected for use. Identifying the game as hopscotch rather than just a game is certainly an instance in which more sophisticated language was used. Sporting would be an element or vocabulary choice that would give us insight into the child's command of vocabulary. And also the word turn. This use of the word turn lets us know that the child uses the word turn to indicate a round in a game, not just physically turning around. So there's this child might have the ability to use the word turn for multiple meanings. Let's look at another sample. In this brief narrative, she playing game, she wants to play, she not sharing, she go home to eat. We have an instance of another attempt or a different attempt to create a story. Please pause your webinar and consider this brief narrative, and particularly from the standpoint of what evidence you might find in this brief sample to indicate that this student had language difficulty. Possible evidence of language difficulty in this brief narrative includes the fact that this student has ambiguous pronominal referencing. The character has not been introduced initially with a specified noun or a name. Instead, the pronoun she or her is used to refer to a character that has not yet been identified. Therefore, this student is using ambiguous pronominal referencing. Certainly, there are no complex sentences in this narrative. There are no elaborated noun or verb phrases, and there's no conjunctive cohesion used in this narrative. In addition, this student has omitted articles, modals, and copulas, and is making pronominal errors. Her not sharing uses the wrong form of the pronoun. And we have a very, very much a lack of literate language, and there is not episodic structure included in this narrative. So a student who created a story with these 4 sentences, although they are saying very little, it's a very brief narrative, there is a lot of evidence or data that could support the assertion that this student has a great deal of language difficulty. When it's time to write the evaluation report, we will want to summarize all of these components of microstructure and how the student has performed in this narrative. So we'll want to write a summary of how many narrative samples were collected and in what context. You'll want to summarize for your report how those samples were elicited, and you'll want to report on each area of microstructure: cohesion, sentence pattern and complexity, and also lexical diversity. For each area of microstructure, you're going to want to report counts of correct and incorrect reductions and or non-attempts if there was something that was not even tried. You might want to, as part of your evaluation, you might want to probe a student's stimulability for including those elements of microstructure through the incorporation of some dynamic assessment probes, and then you would report whether or not that student was stimulable for improved microstructure through those uses of supports. And you, after summarizing the data about microstructure elements, you would want to interpret that data and make a statement about this student's performance in terms of microstructure relative to what is expected for students, for their peers in that community or at that grade level. We've included for you 3 books that you might find helpful as you continue to explore microstructure and analyze microstructure abilities in narratives, as well as 3 articles that can be very helpful in understanding the components of microstructure. We'd like to thank you for participating in this webinar about the analysis of narrative language.